Good morning, everybody. I think it is morning for most of us except for Julianne. On behalf of Australia ICOMOS and the housekeeping team, Caitlin, Lucy and myself, and also our presenter and MC, I welcome you to the Jim Kerr 2020+1 address. I'll now give over to Catherine Forbes, who is our MC. Thanks, Catherine.
Hi, everyone. I have been asked to MC this by ICOMOS. I am the convener of the Australia and New Zealand ICOMOS Joint Scientific Committee on Risk Preparedness. First, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. Australia ICOMOS acknowledges that across the lands and waters, states and territories, we are meeting on the land of the first Australians. We know that this land was never ceded, and we respect the rights and interests of Australia's first peoples in land, culture and heritage. We acknowledge their elders past and present and support the concepts of voice, treaty and truth in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So we're having the Jim Kerr Address today. So who is Jim Kerr and why are we having an address in his honour? James Semple Kerr, AM, was an architectural historian and heritage practitioner in Australia who was prominent in drafting of the original Borough Charter and developing standards for conservation practice. Jim's influence in the conservation movement is most notable for his publication of the Conservation Plan, which has guided building conservation in Australia and around the world. The Jim Kerr Address pays respect to Jim's legacy by perpetuating open inquiry into the understanding of place and the constant review of progress in conservation philosophy and practice. It is held on the 18th of April each year, the same day as ICOMOS International Day of Monuments and Sites, to raise public awareness of the diversity of the world's heritage and the efforts that are required to protect and conserve it, as well as to draw attention to its vulnerability. Today's Jim Kerr Address, as you're probably aware, was originally scheduled for April 2020, but has had to be postponed due to COVID-19. So our 2020+1 address today, we are pleased to have Julianne Polanco speak to us on the very important topic of the cultural dimensions of climate action, driving ambition for resilient communities. Julianne Polanco was appointed State Historic Preservation Officer, California State Parks in 2015 after serving 10 years as Commissioner and Chair of the California State Historical Resources Commission. Prior to that, Julianne was Director of the Cultural Resources for Lend Lease Americas, the Federal Preservation Officer for the Presidio Trust, and Assistant to the Vice President for Programs at the World Monuments Fund. Julianne has held several positions with California State Government, including Advisor to the Chairman of California Integrated Waste Management Board and Special Assistant to the Secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency. In recent years, Julianne is known for promoting the acknowledgement of cultural diversity and heritage in the California communities and working with Andrew Potts in establishing the Global Climate Heritage Network, which promotes the mobilisation of arts, culture and heritage for transformative climate action. Welcome, Julianne.
Thank you so very much. And can you hear me? Yes. Very well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be with all of you today. I come from Marin County in California and respectfully acknowledge this is the traditional home of the Coast Miwok people, many of whom today are tribal citizens of the Federated Indians of the Grayton Rancheria. This is a slide, I think, to start just what are we talking about and what is the topic that we're also very interested in understanding more the intersections. This is the Carr Fire in Northern California in 2018. It burned 230,000 acres, 1,600 buildings, $1.5 billion in damage, and $158 million in the efforts to fight the fire. It was an example of a word that we now know and first learned of then called firenadoes, a phenomenon in which tornadoes and fire create these very interesting and rapid accelerating destruction. 2 years or 3 years ago now, in 2018, this was then the deadliest fire in California. And now in just this short time, it's the 12th. So since 2018, there have been 11 more catastrophic fires. And I think knowing that you all from Australia are all too familiar with these bushfires as well, you can appreciate the significance and the rapid growth of these, rapid increase, I should say, of these catastrophic fires and their effect on communities. So that we know that the climate is changing. We know that there are new risks, new vulnerabilities, and multiple threats to sites. The increase in urbanization, the blending, the bleeding of the rural, urban, wild atmospheres, we call them WUIs in California. Those distinctions are becoming less and less distinct, that there are multiple threats to wealth and equity and unsustainable trade and land use, all contributing to where we are now. In 2015, the Paris Agreement, as we all know, created the United Nations, FCCC, the 195 countries, all with a goal to limit the increase of the global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels. I think this group is a very sophisticated group, I think, to understand also that these are real threats, whether we call it climate change or just experience the changes in atmosphere and their effects on our environment. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change Report told us that the 1 degree increase was already happening, that by 2040, could we go back a slide, please? Thanks. By 2040, that we would already be at 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees by 2065. And so the world needs to stop being overachievers. We need to understand that the urgency is now and that we no longer have the luxury of taking on an issue one at a time. We need to really focus on the decrease of sea level rise, the melting of ice and the coral reefs, in order to make sure, among other things, in order to make sure that we are able to sustain our environment and ourselves into the future. Next. So the slide we just saw was a mudslide of Highway 1 in California. These events happen every year now with post-fire disaster, destabilizing the ground with not enough time for it to recover, the plants to recover. That particular mudslide in January cut off the central part of this California coast in a way that isolated communities with no way in and out, and that condition still exists. So we are on board with nature-based solutions. We know that mitigation and adaptation are high on our list, but in all of these actions, culture seems to be left out of the conversation and is not being terribly engaged in the solutions that we're trying to create. We must partner, we must collaborate, and we must build upon and also incorporate now topics such as just transition, green recovery, and social justice. All of these issues combined together are not mutually exclusive, and it's upon us, the practitioners, the government, and our communities to find better ways to connect together to make these advancements in the real time that we have. It truly is an all hands on deck situation. When we talk about cultural heritage in the intersection of climate change, we're talking about tangible and intangible heritage, about tribal ecological knowledge and resources, larger landscape views rather than looking at isolates in archaeology, collections, buildings, and the performing arts. We know that the Sustainable Development Goals and all the many international initialed events of COP, how those are connecting to our individual communities, to our partners in a way that makes the continuum from local to global, and all of the efforts combine for greater ambition. We must engage people at the local level to not only change behavior, but to sustain culture and people, to create resilient communities. And so how do we do that? How do we drive ambition? And how are we going to make sure that we do it in the urgent matter than the timeframes that we have? I'm going to go through a couple of examples of what we're looking at in California to solve some of these issues and to create better synergies, in hopes that they might be models and examples that people might be able to build upon, and also to engage in conversation later in the presentation. So in 2018, California's climate action report card, if you will, called Safeguarding California, was updated. It's updated on a 5-year rotating basis, and it's the report from the state government to the public, the members of the legislature, about all climate ambition. Prior to this date, there was no mention of culture, there was barely a mention of tribes, and there was a scant mention of archaeology within the California Parks Department. We were able to, for the first time in a major governmental effort, include and embed the idea of culture in climate action as a reality and something that we need to look at, to strive for, and to do better in the ways in which our ambition is moving forward. And so I won't read the statement here, but I think it really speaks to a forward-looking movement to understand new ways and better ways to add to those that we're already doing in climate action since the 70s and 80s for greater, more rapid ambition. California has been already steeped in tribal consultation since the 1970s and 80s, with laws that require consultation with the 145 California tribes. 109 of those are federally recognized nations. We have many layers of immigrants in a single place, and how we fold all of this beautiful mosaic of our history and our communities into government and climate action so that we can make ourselves sustainable and resilient was really the task. Next. So how do we do that? It was a question we asked ourselves, and it was an idea that was also born out of how other state agencies from the air, water, waste capacities understood this role of culture. And luckily, ICOMOS created the Future of Our Past Engaging Culture and Heritage in Climate Action report. So what California has done now, we are using that report. So this amazing document that really is the first groundbreaking document that understands, explains the topic, what the stressors are, where those possible intersections are, and lays out beautifully at the end these categories of things to think about. So California has started, we've started to create a gap analysis where we've taken all the climate ambition from our 4th assessment report, from the Safeguarding California report, and we've included them in one master spreadsheet where all of our state agencies are now participating in understanding where these intersections lie of mitigations of greenhouse gas emissions, net zero energy, the role of heritage and social cohesion. So we are taking a very deep dive and looking at our ambition, where culture can add to an already existing project. For example, in the Northern California coast, our Fish and Wildlife Department was required to restock salmon in a river. And in thinking about what that meant, we put them in touch with the local tribes, where they asked questions about their history and knowledge of the fish in that river, the way in which they were used. And they learned that the fish spawned 4 different kinds of fish, spawned in 4 different seasons. And the tribe had these histories and these stories of food security based on a different spawning season. So the Fish and Wildlife folks were able to do a little bit more research and understand that they could put 2 kinds of fish in that would spawn in different times of the year, therefore increasing the opportunity for the indigenous peoples to have a better year-round salmon response, or a salmon opportunity. They likewise looked at the ways in which they were restoring some stream beds and some of the the sort of little pondings that happen on occasion, and worked with the tribe to reintroduce some of the reeds and the basket weaving materials that the tribe had been missing for the last couple of decades. So already doing a project, just with a little bit more engagement, we're able to meet many different unintended consequences that things they wouldn't have thought of before for greater ambition. So tribes, their cultural practices were further enhanced, and the project was a success. Your own folks, Sheridan Burke, Peter Phillips, and many more were part of this groundbreaking product that we are now ground truthing and testing in California in ways that will tell us how we adapt it to our needs, things that maybe perhaps weren't thought about, and ways in which we can then report back to ICOMOS and share that knowledge so that others in using the report can learn from the work that we've built upon. Next, please. So what else are we doing in this gap analysis? These are an example of some of the projects that we've already identified and those that we are also collecting that were in existence. So in the Western and the Northern California coastal area of where the Karuk tribe has had their indigenous or their ancestral territory and still are the stewards of many of that property, they've joined together with the United States Forest Service on a restoration partnership at the Klamath River. They're using their traditional ecological knowledge and a co-management plan that looks at it on a landscape level rather than an issue specific level to manage both the stream beds and the forests in these ways that are reintroducing seasonal burns that are co-managed by the Forest Service and the tribe in ways that will are proving to improve the health of the forest health, as well as ways that the U.S. Forest Service can then learn from the tribes and apply that to other areas. So that is one area that we're seeing a lot of success and creation of models that both build capacity for the tribes in forest practices, as well as give the U.S. Forest Service a better understanding of looking at an integrated and larger landscape approach to management that can be applied on a greater basis. The California Arts Council has, in the last couple of years through this project, shifted some of their grant programs to now include funding for artists post-disaster recovery. They've understood that climate change has an effect on communities and the artists, and not just the livability and the viability of the arts community, but how that community and how those efforts can play a role in helping communities recover. In Mendocino County on the coast of Northern California, a project was funded by the California Arts Council after a great big fire in 2019 that 6 or 7 children had perished. The community got together and collected bits and pieces of things from the rubble of their homes. And together they created a mural that went up on one of the community, the City Hall buildings. We had a conversation with one of the mothers of the children that had passed away, where she said that in that effort of working on the mural with her community members and through this project, the idea of choosing colors to put in the mural and using those items from her home really helped her to begin to heal and to make decisions. And as she said, to unfreeze herself and be able to move forward in her life past that tragedy. And so we're looking at ways, the California Arts Council is looking at ways to integrate arts and art projects with communities in these different ways for both disaster planning, post-disaster recovery, and really helping communities become more integrated and resilient. Our California State Library is undertaking 2 projects in conjunction with our State Parks Department. One was to help cultural institutions create adaptation plans. So what is their plan for a quick escape? What parts of their collections would they want to or need to find homes for? How would they package them? How would they move them? And at the same time, ask the question of institutions, what space do you have available to accept these types of things should one of our community members need to find a home for them. So they created this mutual aid system, and they got a grant from our federal environmental management team to put boxes, train boxes around the state with supplies. They've contracted with building property movers in advance. They have their plans in place. So if any of them do need to move their collections, there's already a plan to go, and they're working together in that way. It was very low cost. It was just done by conversation and documentation and sharing of resources. Luckily, nobody's had to use it yet, but they know now that that plan is in place. And these are really easy, low cost ways in which institutions can think of something in the short term until they can get their longer plans more solidified. Our California State Lands Commission is responsible for the lands that are owned by the state of California. And when entities want to use them or have permits for them, there's an entire process that sometimes leads to mitigation. In the case of one instance in the Eastern Sierras of California, there was a property that needed to have a land swap. And as part of the mitigation, the State Lands Commission worked with one of the tribes in that area, and they were able to have purchased as mitigation some 40 acres that were then repatriated back to the tribe. So it was an opportunity for, in this public way, that tribe received back some of their ancestral lands. And that was a really amazing outcome of this conversation in the Cultural Resources Climate Change Task Force. Our California Energy Commission is working with tribal governments to do a gap analysis of their individual capacities, their governmental capacities for energy. And they're working towards finding ways that are sustainable and that will allow them to have energy independence. Those are all just some of the projects that are being worked on in our state government partners as a result and as part of this gap analysis that we're working on. Next slide, please. This is an example of just from 2011 to 2014, the drought that we're experiencing in the state. In 2014, we had 7,200 fires that burned 620,000 kilometers. So you can see the difference just from 11 to 14. In 2020, there were 8,100 fires, so maybe 1,000 more, but burned 4.5 million acres. And if we remember that one fire in 2018 cost $1.5 billion in damage and 158 million to fight the fire, the magnitude of that cost to communities is multiplied by 5 times in the current situation. So we know that this is real. You remember the slide about the mudslides. Fires are now, our fire seasons are leading into the rainy seasons, which are leading to bigger mudslides. And this cycle is continuing. So it's really urgent that we look at these things and figure out ways to solve them, or at least to minimize them in the present and in the future. Next slide, please. Another project that we're working on, we're very excited about this project and especially its connections to Australia. John Day and Scott Heron of James Cook University, along with Andrew Potts of ICOMOS, Adam Markham of the United Concerned Scientists in the United States, and Ewan Heslop of Historic Environment Scotland, have all been working on a climate vulnerability index assessment. As you know, or many of you know, that these CVIs, as they're called, exist in the environmental world as a tool to understand what values of plants and animals in site are present, what are the climate stressors and the climate threats, and then that gets coupled with the climate projections, all to inform stewardship of a place. But what's missing often in these are the cultural values of site and their co-benefit to preserving on a very landscape level, retaining, preserving, understanding what kinds of values from cultural heritage are present and should be considered. So in the CVI that John and Scott have developed, they looked at this really in association with World Heritage properties. The first was at Shark Bay. They did a second assessment at Orkney Island in Scotland, a Neolithic site in conjunction with Historic Environment Scotland. And they included the cultural values of outstanding universal value and also of community vulnerability. So what were the economic, social, and cultural aspects of a site that should also be incorporated when one is assessing the climate vulnerability and understanding future stewardship opportunities? Next slide. So we in California are taking their framework. We have 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in California. 2 are natural, our Redwoods and Yosemite National Park. And 1 is a building in Los Angeles that's part of a Frank Lloyd Wright district, if you will. And so that outstanding universal value really doesn't get us very far in assessing the impacts of culture and the importance of culture when we're looking at climate vulnerability assessments. So we are working with the Scripps Institute of Oceanography out of UC San Diego, and with John and Scott, with Andrew Potts of ICOMOS and Historic Environment Scotland, Ewan Heslop, to really figure out how we can create a vulnerability assessment that has a heritage lens. When we involve living cultures and communities as a key pillar, and we look at heritage communities and add that to the value, we really believe that we're going to have a better snapshot of what's important to communities, what's important culturally, what's important ecologically, and when we compare that to the stressors and the projections, management decisions will be that much more balanced and able to understand how those traditional cultural practices are also protected and retained into the future. So we're involving the value of adjacent communities, which means all peoples that have an association with a place, whether it's a neighbor or somebody's grandparents or anybody who wants to participate, all the very levels of waves of immigrants in a place, for example. We're involving our tribal nations, and we're using the United States equivalent of the National Register of Historic Places criteria, all of those 3 things to be combined to derive a cultural value that's a consortium of all of those things that will then play into the role of cultural the environmental attributes of a site when we're looking at stewardship going forward. It's a really new project. We're excited to take the framework and test it to make it malleable to California. But our goal also is to help test it in a way that shows and demonstrates that anybody, any location can add their own value set to this framework and in a rapid assessment format, understand how the role of culture can play into the climate change decisions that are being made going forward. Next slide, please. I will also just say about the CVI that simultaneously ICOMOS and Historic Environment Scotland and the John and Scott at James Cook University have received a grant from the UK government to look at the very same thing in Africa. So there'll be 2 projects going on there that'll test those values for the local communities. And then there are some other projects that are going on. Historic Environment Scotland is also going to be working on these in all of their World Heritage sites, with the idea that in a couple of years, when we've all sort of tested our own value sets, to get together and really understand how these frameworks can be adaptable and then put them out for anybody to use. And I think that those 3 different models, our goal is that those 3 different models will really demonstrate the capacity for a quick, systematic way to do these assessments that also really incorporates local values. This is a slide of the Santa Barbara coast. And I think in addition to the fact that the colors are just very pretty, it shows the red are the mountains that were burned in some fires in 2019. The blue areas show you the watershed but also show where the mudslides happened. And I don't know if any of you saw this in your news, but this entire stretch of the highway, which is the bottom line in the blue, into the coast, there were some significant village sites that were existing in that area as well. So you can see the flow of and the compounding factor of fire, and then rapid rain, and then the flooding and the mudslides that happened. This was very catastrophic. People were covered in the mud and died. There were loss of life. And I think this picture just really shows us on a bigger scale the many different climate threats that are happening to a site, and the absolute need for us to really move ahead in our solutions so that we can help prevent these things from happening. Next slide, please. So the Climate Heritage Network, as Catherine mentioned, with Andrew Potts and ICOMOS as our secretariat and a host of others, we are now up to 200 members strong. The network is intended to bring to light, to daylight, to work together on this intersection of cultural heritage and climate action. It's a network of networks, if you will. So we have the American Institute of Architects and the International Federation of Museums, and some governments and some universities and some practitioners. So it's this big collection of people who are all working on this intersection in advancing the Paris Agreement goals. It really is creating a culture of resiliency. We're working to create new synergies and really combine technology and science and people. So how do we connect my 85-year-old dad sitting in his armchair with his iPad and wanting to understand what he can do in climate change, to what's happening at the COP convenings to talk about how we're meeting these goals on a global level. The network is illuminating the role of arts and culture and heritage, the role that we play in creating a resilient world and creating resilient communities. And ICOMOS is a big part of that effort. We, in September and October, when COP was supposed to happen, the convening of peoples in Glasgow, there was a virtual effort that went on, and we had something that was called Culture by Climate, where we had over 20 different global events in several different languages to talk about what was happening in South America and what was happening in the Asia Pacific Isles and what was happening in California and the United States. And there are all different levels of interventions and examples and speakers talking about the work that we're doing in an effort to share and build upon, rather than everybody starting from the beginning. We have now also created what we're calling the Madrid to Glasgow plan. So what are the top 8 things in this intersection of culture and climate change that we really want to focus on, work on, and highlight at the next convening at Peoples in Glasgow this November? And they include things like a net zero carbon calculator for buildings, how we communicate this topic to others. And all of that information is available on the website, but it's an amazing explosion of partners, all purposed around the fact that culture is climate change and climate change is culture. And it's really about showing what's actionable and what's possible in a world where talking about ambition no longer is a luxury. I think I'll end there. I hope that I gave you, my intention was to give you a quick overview of sort of the things that we're tackling in California. I think in pre-COVID, we were the 5th largest economy in the world. And so how do we get people who are inclined to be looking at climate change to consider, to understand they may have already been considering, but especially to not forget the important role that culture plays and every ambition that we're delivering people to the conversation. And without people coming to the conversation, we will have no chance of changing behavior. And we absolutely need to work together to sustain and uplift our communities for resiliency into the future. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to having a conversation with Catherine and with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julianne. The examples you've been giving are just wonderful in demonstrating how to connect global ambition in regard to climate change with local communities and how important that is. I think climate change can feel like this enormous weight on an individual and they can't tackle it on their own, but when people work together, they can actually make positive change. They can, lift that sense of despair and fear and replace it with an action that can actually bring hope for the future for their community and their culture, for future generations as well. I think also, as you clearly demonstrated, and as everyone here in Australia ICOMOS knows, we have very, very similar issues, particularly with regard to the fires and in Eastern Australia last year, in Tasmania the year before, in Western Australia now, they've just been astronomical in scale, way beyond the action of people to respond totally, but we can respond in planning ahead and developing much better land management practices based on the experiences of our traditional people. So I think one of the first questions I'd like to ask is, who initiates some of these actions? You've talked a lot about what the state is doing. Do communities come and initiate some of these actions? Do corporations do that, or is it really coming from state level?
I think it's all of the above. And so the Cultural Resources Climate Change Task Force was instituted or stood up to look at all of these issues. And we have started our own gap analysis, and some of those examples that I gave you were things that were already ongoing in state agencies. The Karuk and the U.S. Forest Service partnership has been going on for a number of years, and so we're not only looking at what's possible, we're also looking at what's happening, and the plan for that task force is then to sort of get our collection together and then go out to the public and say, here's what we're thinking, what are you thinking? And engage our tribal communities to do the same. So when we put that plan together for the next update of what we're finding and what we're recommending as policy changes for the state, we've engaged our communities and our tribes. But because we know that we don't have the luxury of waiting, we're doing sort of a lot of things in parallel. So while we're getting ourselves together, we're also talking to governments and we're talking to corporations, and we're looking at any of these examples that people are working on and collecting and encouraging more collaborative than a sprint, because we are at the same time understanding the possibility, we're having to act. And so there's a lot of parallel efforts going on to collect information and learn from each other as we're developing that. So yes, it's coming from all different aspects. And the beauty of the Climate Heritage Network is that it gives us a greater expanse to understand what's already happening in the private sector, in the nonprofit world, in collaborations to build upon. And we're finding those connections are also a really good way for us to more rapidly advance action. I will also just quickly say that in the efforts that we're undertaking, we've been given two charges. One, let's solve the problem for our state, but also let's create frameworks that others can use in other states, within other countries, who maybe don't have the resources or the ability to say the word climate change, but see the effects of change in their daily lives. And so I really love our dual purposed mission of solving our own problems, but also being conscious of creating frameworks and making sure that we're setting frameworks up that can be taken and used by others to help with that increased ambition globally. Catherine, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Julianne. From what you're saying, you're really demonstrating how important it is to build these relationships and build this trust so that people can work together. And I found, when we had our bushfires in the eastern states just 12 months ago, and the Aboriginal community became very active in the responses with the government, and there was a lot of conversation about adapting Aboriginal care of country, their cultural burning practices and so on, to try and manage risk. And a lot of people, it wasn't just politicians, it was firefighters, it was farmers, all getting involved in this conversation. I'm hoping to see action coming out of that conversation, but I haven't seen it yet. I know some individuals are working with Aboriginal communities on Aboriginal land, but to see that at a larger scale would be really, really interesting, and it would show that we are learning as much as we are giving, I guess. I think one of the other things that you talked about was the future of our pasts. That very, very important groundbreaking document that ICOMOS was involved in and launched last year, I think it was. And Australia, ICOMOS did contribute to that through Peter Phillips and others here. It has a table at the back which lists a lot of the threats, and then looks at what the consequences of those threats might be on cultural heritage, but not just buildings or landscape, but on communities, on archaeology, on a very broad range of cultural heritage and living heritage. So I'd just like to draw that to everybody's attention, because the document is available online through the ICOMOS website, and it's really worth a look when you're looking at the places that you're trying to manage. But I'd like to know a little bit more about how California is testing that document and what we might be able to do in Australia in our use of that information to improve the resilience of our communities and our heritage.
So I think that the sort of beauty of this being a new intersection, if you will, is that there aren't frameworks or models to look at. The downside is there aren't frameworks or models to look at. So nobody had an expectation of how we should run this task force. And in fact, my office was given the lead because I was the one that raised my hand that we needed it. And so how did we get started? Well, at the same time, Andrew and Marcy Rockman and others had asked me to peer review this document. And I was so happy to see the work, because it's exactly what we needed to get started. It landed in our laps like the best gift ever at the very right time. So we fashioned our gap analysis really closely to that table that you mentioned. And we've just gotten to the point it's taken us. So I should also say that the effort came with no new staff and no new money. And it was started right 2 months before COVID hit. So everybody pivoting to the way they were going to work, everybody already overwhelmed with the work that they had to do, but we had to keep moving forward. So my ambition of that gap analysis taking 1 year has really taken us 2.5 years. But it's had some unintended consequences, which I'll talk about in a minute. But to answer your question, we're modeling all of the action. So we've listed all the ambitions, and then we've given a code to all of the different stressors and the different situations that the table presents. And then we're also identifying places where some things that are specific to our projects were not included, and where some things maybe weren't as clear. So we're truly test driving the framework and finding it to be 90% what we could use and about 10% that we're needing to adjust. And so we're purposely doing that in a way to help also increase the usefulness of the document. So at some point we also will create something that will report back to ICOMOS about what our experience was with it. But I think it's important to understand that we are undertaking this with no new resources except human interest and the government and the state's directive to do something, and really this framework has really helped us focus on how to contain that really overwhelming capacity, and the many different things, how we really can put some sort of parameters around it so we don't get so overwhelmed with the volume that we don't get anything done. So I think it's been useful for those reasons. The unintended consequence of COVID and making things a little bit slower in the way that we got our gap analysis off the ground was that we were still having monthly meetings and we were still having conversations with all the levels of government involved and all the different agencies. And some of those projects that I mentioned, like the state lands buyback for the tribes and others, were really born out of those participants being and reading and following along and keeping up with the intersection and the possibilities, and then sparking on their own what could be possible and just making it happen. And so I think that document has really given everybody whatever level of familiarity you are with the subject, from our air and water experts to our land policy experts, the same level playing field of information and understanding. Everybody read the document. We talked about it like a book club, and we had guest speakers come in and help us with it. And that really helped the conversation move a lot faster. And this ambition that's happening while the gap analysis is still being finished wouldn't have been possible, I'm quite sure, without that document.
You mentioned that you've had these ongoing conversations and speakers. Has that included like scientists and people who are working the land, or
yes,
from all different aspects of life?
All different aspects,
bringing everyone together.
And we're expanding the definition of culture to be more than just buildings and archaeology. It's also, we have members of our state library, and we have our California Tourism Board joining us. Very important point of land stewardship and culture. We have our the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, who are in charge of climate change, on board with us. Our tribal communities are represented with the Governor's Tribal Advisor. And as I mentioned, our California Arts Council and our California Humanities Council, who are both grant-making entities and also sort of in those collections and creative arts. So we're connecting with performing arts, we're connecting with visual arts, and youth and education. So we're expanding everyone's definition of culture to be more than just buildings and archaeology, and living communities.
I think that's really important, because heritage, cultural heritage is of value to people. And it contributes to their life, and it's really important to understand that very much broader scope than we often talk about, particularly when you think about heritage authorities, they list items which are very tangible, and the intangible tends to be lost along the way. So might list a building, but the building may have particular uses that are really important to a community, and bringing that community together may be part of their safety net. So I think it's really important to have all those people working together. I found recently in looking at risks to parts of Sydney, I've been liaising with firefighters and police and lots of different emergency services, and they haven't really thought about heritage very much before, but once you start talking to them and making it more personal to their own lives, they actually get right on board and are very enthusiastic about trying to account for heritage in what they're doing. So, so thank you for that. I'd also like to ask our audience whether they have any particular questions for us. Sheridan Burks sent through a little note here. The ICOMOS Triennial Scientific Plan 21-24 is based on the Futures of Our Past report and is focused ahead on what each committee is doing in climate change action. So Australia ICOMOS and all the ISCs are asked to identify their activities on climate change action. This is a unanimous resolution of the General Assembly of 2020. So we're all
Very
being
exciting.
asked to contribute to that.
Yeah,
And,
no, it's very exciting. And I have to say bravo to ICOMOS for passing that resolution and really modeling what you're messaging. I say that all the time, that we have to model what we message. And I think, you know, when ICOMOS makes this declaration on a global level to include climate action and the climate emergency and all the different in your triennial scientific plan and all the different scientific and committees that you're working on, others follow and others respect that idea and that knowledge and are eager to join in the conversation. So I think that ICOMOS.
okay, I've got another question here. Are there many Australian members in the Climate Heritage Network? We seem to have lost Julianne. I think there are a few. You can join as...
It's really a great tribute to your organization.
There we go. We missed some of that answer, Julianne, or I did. Okay. So another question, is the Getty active in climate change and heritage?
I'm sorry, Catherine, I missed the first part of that. I just got change in heritage.
Okay. Is the Getty active in climate change and heritage?
We have initiated conversations to be more engaged and hope that they will join in. I think that they are involved in different activities and different focuses, particularly with ICOMOS. I'm not sure that they're mission tasked to really take on climate action as one of their main focuses, but I do think that there's a recognition, and we're seeing greater involvement in some of the different activities they're working on, involving a layer of climate change for greater benefit. So I don't know how to answer that question. I don't think they're taking it on and leading the charge. I think that they are, though, adding those layers to their initiatives more and more, which is wonderful. And we're also sort of engaging with them about how we might work together to bring more partners from developing countries into the Climate Heritage Network conversation, so that we can start reaching those groups as well.
Okay. I've got a question from Jeff Robinson. How do organisations join the Climate Heritage Network?
There's a website. It's just www.climateheritage.org. There's a self-populated form that you fill out, and then the application gets vetted and voted on by the steering committee, and then you're in. So as long as you're a viable organization and not a bot, and you want to join the conversation, I don't think we've turned anyone away. Everyone's welcome. And in 2 years, as I said, in 2 years, we're more than 200 members globally, which is really exciting.
Another question. Have we historically developed country in vulnerable areas, and are we still developing in locations that provide too much risk? So does the Climate Heritage Network have a view on this? So I think it's our development going out into areas that are fragile or vulnerable.
So is it about the, I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the question, is it about the expansion of development in those areas?
I think it must be. I'm just trying to understand the question myself. Have we historically developed country in vulnerable areas, and are we still developing in locations that provide too much risk? So globally, or
well, I think the idea, I think so. I'll answer the question about what the Climate Heritage is working on sustainable development. And when I talked about that sort of urban, rural, wild intersection, I love the term WUI that people use in California. It just always makes me laugh. But I don't think, we don't have a specific initiative yet on that's focused just on development and in those intersections. It's part of a bigger conversation. And honestly, this is the first year that we've, in our Madrid to Glasgow fund, this is the first year that we've sort of highlighted 8 overall themes that have some of those threads. I think the network just isn't yet advanced or developed enough to be taking on individual tasks on a more focused basis. But it certainly is something that's involved in all of the conversations that we're looking at sustainable development and new development patterns, perhaps, and those kinds of things. So I hope that answers the question. If there are, I should also say that if there are questions that I'm not answering, you could Google me, my web address, my office web address is on the internet. I'm always happy to answer people's questions as well.
Okay, I'm just seeing if there's more questions come through. No, that's it. So I was thinking, there isn't, when you join the Climate Heritage Network, you make a commitment to be active in promoting climate action. So yes, so I'm just saying to ICOMOS members, if you'd like to join, think about what you are committing to, and then put those actions into place, implement them.
And we also, because we're a network of networks, we have lots of other organizations like ICOMOS that are members, and a lot of them are combining the existing work they're doing and making a dual contribution to the efforts that the Climate Heritage Network is working on. So, for example, the net zero carbon, that there's a group called the Zero Net Carbon Coalition, and they're made up of a lot of building organizations and architects in the United States who are focused on carbon calculators. They are part of the working group of the Climate Heritage Network that's working on the same thing. And then we have likewise, Peter Cox from Ireland, and we have some folks in the UK who are working on carbon calculators. And so while everybody's working on them in their own normal work, the contribution to the Climate Heritage Network is we're not creating a separate climate calculator. Rather, we're looking at what are the heritage values that should be included in any carbon calculator for the built environment, so that if Zimbabwe has one and Chicago has one, they don't have to reshift all of their work. They could just add that layer to make it more complete. So we're trying to find ways to not reinvent processes, but what are the cultural values that every process might consider? What does that look like in some examples? And then make that available to anybody who wants to use it, so they could include heritage buildings, for example, in their carbon calculation, building reduction goals that they set.
Okay.
Thank you. Somebody's put the website up in the chat. Thank you so much.
Other question, I've one from Caitlin. She'd be interested to hear more about Julie's work in the California Native American tribes. Has this been a harmonious relationship?
So both in the climate work we're doing and in the regulatory work of my office. So our office, state historic preservation offices in the United States do a couple of things. They are responsible on behalf of the federal government for heritage listing at the national level. A lot of states have their own heritage listing. And then we also implement the federal reviews for projects and their effects on cultural heritage. So it's called the National Historic Preservation Act, has an obligation that any federal agency or use of federal funds will have to consider cultural heritage and the effects to cultural heritage in their project. So it's the companion to the National Environmental Policy Act. So my office reviews those projects where we make sure the agencies do what they're supposed to be doing, including speaking with communities and meaningfully consulting with tribes. And when I mentioned the federally versus non-federally recognized tribes in the federal framework, federally recognized tribes have a different standing in those consultations than non-federally recognized tribes traditionally. In California, we say that it's prudent for agencies to consult with all tribes because those that aren't federally recognized still fall into the category of public. And while that's not to minimize the importance of their governmental nations, it still means that the federal agency has an obligation to consult with the public. So we tell them it's in their best interest to consult with all of them. It is to answer the question, our relationships are ongoing rather than issue-based. And so we spend a lot of time understanding what our tribes, what they're interested in, what their desires and their aspects are, what they're trying to repatriate, for example, or whether they own their ancestral land or just are stewards of it. And every tribe has a different governmental framework, so they all want to be engaged differently. And so our relationships with them are just a constant building partnership, so that when we do come to these consultations and we play more of a mediator role and making sure everybody follows the federal process, we have a sense of who we need to talk to and how the tribes want to be engaged. There's a lot of trauma associated with the history of tribes in California and Indigenous communities globally. And so I think a lot of the work that we do, we also always recognize the sort of social justice issues that need to be rectified, and try to really work towards those ends and the work that we're doing, even though it's not our primary charge. We believe that it's all of our responsibility to make sure that our frameworks and our systems are really in a just and honest way, and that the word meaningful means something in consultation. So as an example, my office is currently working on what's called a multiple property document submission form. It takes the context of history that's required to list something on the National Register. There's two parts to it. So one is the context in history, and one is how the property conveys that context. We are taking in a statewide sense, the story of the California missions, which has been told by many people known. It's taught in school. There are 21 missions. Many of them are on the National Register, but there is no history from the first person voice. There is no tribal history included. It's always from someone else's viewpoint, or the Spanish and the sort of colonization story. So we're working with over 60 tribes that affiliate with those missions to hear their stories, to develop those themes, to get their voices, and add that layer to the already known National Register context of the missions. So it's a really big undertaking, and there's a lot of trauma and conversation associated with, do we use the word genocide, and can we, and should we be talking about inscription versus slavery? And we've really just created the path for the tribes to have their voice and tell us what they want, and we're just managing the framework of getting to that document. We're really proud of that work. And we're really pleased that we're able to do that work in the confines of government. But those things can be done on any level. And I think that the more that we start making those avenues available and building capacity for our Indigenous communities, the richer our societies will be.
Yes, I think in Australia we're going through a similar process. So it takes time, and it certainly takes a concerted effort to build relationships and maintain those relationships, build trust and maintain that trust, so that, and respect, I think, is the big thing. Respect for the stories and that heritage that's coming through.
Yeah, I
heritage that
agree
we
with
have
you.
been unaware with in the past, but that we are certainly being made aware of now.
I agree with you. And I was just about to use that word, respect. Everybody wants to be respected, and everybody wants to see their stories, the stories of their ancestors and their people and their presence represented and raised up in ways. And I think that the beauty of history and the beauty of culture is that I always say it's a growth industry. There's enough room and enough capacity for as much as we want to include. And so in my role in the head of the office in California, I feel like it's my job to remove barriers and welcome people into the conversation. And we ask our public, what would you like to see? What do you want us to focus on? And when we do these culture-based documents, we did one for the Asian Pacific Islanders in California and the Latinos in the 20th century in California. We have a community advisory board made up of people around the state, scholars and community members and academics and teachers. And we ask them to help us identify the themes and tell us what properties might go with it. And it really is also a way to include intangible heritage, that buildings are really the containers for stories. And sometimes the buildings are the story, but oftentimes it's the place that really holds the memory. And how do we sort of twist our frameworks that we have on the national level to be more inclusive in that way? And we're really trying to sort of turn those dynamics on their head and challenge them to be more responsive to what the communities would like.
Thank you. I have another question. Do you think the previous lack of cultural engagement and the lack of including cultural aspects in climate change has been a factor in climate change denial?
Yes, I do. And I think, you know, we don't need to repeat the last 4 years of what happened in the United States in the realm of denial of climate change or many other things. But I think that people know something's happening and sometimes they don't know how to articulate it. And I think that the denial of culture, the lack of inclusion of culture sort of had to put a barrier for people to sort of, that seemed maybe too big to straddle or to climb. And when we include frameworks that make people comfortable or that respect their ways, we provide avenues to have those conversations and work together better. And I think that social cohesion aspect of culture, in whether it's climate change or whatever topic, you know, is so important to making people feel included and overcoming fear. Fear is such a deciding factor in so many things, and I think that culture is really a binding agent that will help advance whatever the topic is, and particularly climate change.
I think part of climate change denial is also it's really denying or failing to accept any responsibility in having to deal with it. And sometimes I think if a positive way or a door is open to show how you can take a responsible action to improve the situation, people will change, particularly if they can see a benefit. So I've got a comment here from Sheridan for you. Julie has just amply demonstrated what the actions of one person can lead to, just as Jim Kerr did. So congratulations.
Thank you for that kind word. I'm honored, and I did a little bit of studying about Jim Kerr, and I take that compliment very well. Thank you. But I do think that it really is a group effort, and I'm really lifted up by my staff and the members of the Climate Heritage Network and ICOMOS. You know, we all work together, and I'm happy to be part of this conversation to really make our communities sustainable into the future.
Okay, I've got one more question here. How do you think the change of President, Congress and Senate will make it easier for you to do your work on heritage and climate change?
Well, I think that we were lucky in California that we had the framework that we did to continue the conversation in the last 4 years, sometimes to the detriment of the state and when the battles would happen. But I also think we took it on as a way to continue the conversation for the United States until, and hopefully now with the change. I think the Biden administration has already stood up climate policy quickly. I think they have a lot of work to do in understanding the depth and the breadth of the changes that happened in the last administration in all media, air, waste, land management. So I think there's going to be sort of two parts to it, the ambitions and the goals that they're standing up, and then the reality of what happened on the ground that they're going to have to then redirect. So they've got a lot of work to do. I think, how is that going to affect our work? I think our ambition was multiplied because of the situation, and with our change in governors, our new governor, I think, upped our ambition, but also said we don't lessen our ambition, but we have so much to do that we now cannot have the luxury of single issues. So we've been challenged with multiple outcomes in a single initiative, which is really helping the whole integration of culture into climate action. I think with the new Biden administration, the hope and the promise is that we can now have these conversations on a bigger scale in the United States, and hopefully in a more cohesive way across the country, to both learn from each other and also for the United States to help with ambition globally. So I think just having more hands to do this light work, make light work, is really what we're excited about in that regard.
Okay, there's another comment. This one's from Alan Croker. So important to have the voices of Indigenous communities expressed honestly in their own words. For far too long, non-Indigenous people have been in control of the language. One group of stolen generation survivors here in Australia want the word kidnapped used instead of stolen, and cultural genocide front and centre of the cause. So good to see Julie referring to this issue. We have a long way to go and it must be inclusive. And I think one of the conversations we had about a week ago was talking about inclusivity and not layering cultural values, but accepting everybody's cultural values on equal terms.
I agree with you. And I think that, you know, these ideas of just transition and how we address colonization and how we address, you know, sort of the experiences of many cultural communities, and as we have layers, I think in our efforts to really sort of right those wrongs of the past and really look at every one of our frameworks and say, where have we put those barriers and where have we put exclusions and how do we fix it? We also have to be really aware that we can't solve discrimination by discriminating, right? So I think it's a really hard test to say, you know, as that pendulum shifts and we maybe give more primacy to stories of our African American communities, or we raise up our Indigenous communities, we have to also do it in a way that doesn't just have the same action, but just change the positions of people. And I think that's where fear comes in, that when that there's a fear that you're going to lose your primacy. And so I think when we're making those shifts and looking at how we're putting those systems back together, we have to always remember that and make sure that we're not just shifting the conversation, but really truly making systemic changes so everybody feels that they can contribute as they desire.
Thank you. I have a call for Australia ICOMOS members, and I haven't discussed this with the committee, and we need to work out how this can happen. But just as you've been doing in California, I would like to see if we can collect case studies that reflect how communities are working in climate action in Australia. I think it would very much help our case when we're going to politicians and to decision makers to have that data. So it's a call to ICOMOS members, and a way of collecting that. The other thing that I'd like to ask, based on what you've presented today, is that each of our states do a gap analysis based on that Future of Our Past report, and similarly to the way California has done it, because I think it will help us to focus on where we need to act. So thank you very much, Julianne. I think we've come to the end of our talk, but I have a couple of announcements to make. We have a webinar series that ICOMOS is putting on that will continue this discussion. It is on caring for country and in climate change. So the webinar series is currently being organised by the Caring for Country Committee through ICOMOS webinar series, so that's ICOMOS International. The series will provide an opportunity for the voices of Indigenous people to discuss Indigenous heritage, cultural landscape and climate change in Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. The series is planned to start in July 2021 and extend through into 2022. And it will be followed by a face-to-face workshop on caring for country in climate change to continue leading up to the GA 2023, which will be in Sydney. The organising committee is led by Helen Wilson and comprises mostly ICOMOS members, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous from Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. This Jim Kerr Address is actually the 2020 Jim Kerr Address, even though it's 2020+1. There will be another one this year in April. So save the date, it will be the 18th of April and there will be more details coming out shortly. So thank you everybody. Georgia, is there anything else that we need to do? No? Okay. So unless anyone else has something burning question, I think we shall close it for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you all today.
Thank you very, very much. And there are lots of thank yous coming through on the chat and congratulations for you. So thank you, Julianne.
Thank you. I look forward to keeping up with what your work's doing and learning from you all as well. So we'll just keep our conversation going. Yes,
we definitely need to sort of learn about how you're applying that Future Our Past report in the gap analysis that you're underdoing.
Very well.
Take
care, everybody. Be well.
Bye-bye.